My name is Harper, and I'm 32 years old. Right now, I'm standing in a courtroom, staring across the aisle at the two people who were supposed to love me most in this world. My parents, they're not here to support me. They're here to sue me for every penny I have. $3.8 million to be exact. My mother's eyes are cold as ice, her lips pressed into a thin line. My father sits beside her with this smug expression, like he's already won. The judge adjusts his glasses and looks at me. Miss Harper, you've heard the plaintiff's claims. How do you respond? I take a deep breath, my hands trembling slightly. What I'm about to say will expose a truth so devastating that it will change everything in this courtroom forever. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and while you're at it, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. This story has more twists than you can imagine, and the ending will leave you speechless. Now, let's get into it. I grew up in a suburban neighborhood in Connecticut, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and appearances mattered more than anything. My family looked perfect from the outside. Upper middle class home with a white picket fence, 2 cars in the driveway, annual holiday cards with all of us smiling in matching sweaters. My mother, Marianne, was 58 now, always impeccably dressed and active in the neighborhood association. My father, Gerald, 61, worked in middle management and spent his weekends obsessing over his lawn. Then there was my younger brother, Philip, who was 28 and basically the family disappointment. From as far back as I could remember, I was labeled the responsible one, the golden child, the one who would make something of herself. Philip, on the other hand, couldn't seem to do anything right in their eyes. He dropped out of college twice, struggled with substances on and off, and bounced from job to job without ever finding his footing. But here's the thing about being the golden child in a family like mine. It didn't mean I was treasured. It meant I was useful. I threw myself into academics because that's what they expected. I got straight A's, joined every club, became valedictorian of my high school. When college acceptance letters came, I got into Princeton with a full scholarship. My parents threw a party and invited the whole neighborhood, showing me off like a trophy they'd won. But when the guests left and it was just us, my mother looked at me and said, "Now don't let this go to your head. You still have a lot to prove." I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in finance. At 23, I landed a position at a prestigious investment firm in Manhattan. I was making $45,000 a year, which felt like a fortune to me back then. I rented a tiny studio apartment in Queens and took the subway to work every day. I was proud of myself. But my parents saw something different. They saw an ATM machine that had finally started dispensing cash. The requests started small. My mother called saying they needed help with property taxes because they'd had unexpected expenses, $18,000. I was making barely enough to cover my own rent and student loans for books and living expenses that the scholarship hadn't covered, but I sent them the money. Then my father needed a new roof. $12,000. I put it on a credit card. Then Philip went to rehab for the 3rd time, and somehow it became my responsibility to pay for it. $35,000 for a 90-day program. I took out a personal loan. Every time I gave them money, they'd praise me publicly. At family gatherings, my mother would tell everyone how successful I was, how generous, what a good daughter. But privately, there was never a thank you, just an expectation that this was my duty. They were my parents. They'd raised me. I owed them. And if I ever hesitated, if I ever suggested that maybe I couldn't afford something, my mother would get this wounded look on her face and my father would go silent in that way that made me feel like I'd committed some unforgivable sin. Meanwhile, Philip got endless chances and endless excuses. He was struggling. He was sensitive. He needed support. But me? I was strong. I was capable. I could handle it. Looking back now, I realize they never once asked how I was doing emotionally. Never asked if I was happy or stressed or scared about money. I was 25 years old, working 80-hour weeks, eating ramen noodles for dinner most nights, and sending them thousands of dollars while they lived comfortably in their paid-off house. But I kept telling myself this was normal. This was what family did. Then, when I turned 28, everything changed. I'd been working on a major merger deal for months, barely sleeping, practically living at the office. When it closed successfully, I got promoted to senior partner and received a massive bonus, $1.2 million before taxes. I was stunned. I'd never seen that much money in my life. I paid off all my debts, moved into a better apartment, and for the first time ever, I felt like I could breathe. That feeling lasted exactly 3 days. On day 4, my parents showed up at my apartment unannounced. They didn't knock. My mother had somehow gotten a copy of my key. I came home from work to find them sitting in my living room like they owned the place. My father had this look on his face, the one he got when he was about to ask for something big. "We have an incredible investment opportunity," he said. "A commercial real estate deal. My buddy has an inside connection. We could double our money in a year, but we need to move fast." My mother chimed in with how this could secure their retirement, how they'd spent their whole lives working and sacrificing. The ask? $500,000. I told them I needed to think about it. For the first time in my life, I didn't immediately say yes. The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. My mother's face went hard. My father stood up and said they'd expected more from me after everything they'd done. Then they left without another word. That was the beginning of the end, though I didn't know it yet. Over the next few months, the pressure was relentless. My mother called me every single day, sometimes multiple times. She'd cry about how they'd sacrificed everything to raise me, how they'd put me through school even though I'd had a scholarship, how they'd supported my dreams. My father would send me articles about successful investments and family businesses, with little notes about how this was our chance to build generational wealth together. Philip even called, which was rare. He said Mom and Dad were really counting on this, that it would mean so much to them, that maybe this would finally make them happy. I felt like I was being crushed under the weight of their expectations. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus at work. My therapist, who I'd started seeing for work-related stress, told me I needed to set boundaries. But I didn't know how. These were my parents. How do you say no to the people who raised you? So I gave in. I wrote them a check for $500,000. We signed what my father called a family agreement, though it was literally just a note written on a napkin saying they'd pay me back with 20% interest within 1 year. I remember my mother hugging me and saying she was so proud that I was finally acting like a real daughter. My father shook my hand like we'd just closed a business deal. I felt sick to my stomach but told myself this was the right thing to do. For the first few months, they'd send me occasional updates. The deal was progressing, paperwork was being filed, everything was on track, but they were always vague on details. When I asked to see contracts or property information, my father would get defensive and say I didn't trust him, so I stopped asking. Then, 6 months in, I casually asked my mother how the investment was going during one of our monthly dinners. She got this weird look on her face and changed the subject. My father said these things take time, and I needed to be patient. Something in my gut told me to look into it myself. I used my connections in finance to do some digging. I searched property records in the areas my father had mentioned. Nothing. I called the supposed business partner. The number was disconnected. I hired a private investigator, and what he found made me physically ill. There was no investment. There had never been an investment. The money was gone, spent over 6 months on things that had nothing to do with real estate. $78,000 for a luxury car my father had been driving around, $42,000 for cosmetic surgeries my mother had gotten done, $93,000 to pay off credit cards Philip had maxed out, again. The rest had been spent on vacations, fancy dinners, a trip to Vegas where my father had gambled away $30,000 in a weekend. They'd lied to me, stolen from me, and apparently felt completely justified in doing it. I arranged a family dinner at their house the following week. I printed out every bank statement, every receipt, every piece of evidence my investigator had found. I laid it all out on their dining room table like a prosecutor presenting a case. "Tell me about the investment," I said, my voice shaking. My father didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He glanced at the papers and then at me with this expression of annoyance, like I was being dramatic. "It's family money anyway," he said. "We raised you. We fed you and clothed you and put a roof over your head for 18 years. You think that was free?" My mother jumped in, her voice rising. How dare you come in here and accuse us like we're criminals? After everything we've done for you. After all our sacrifices, this is how you repay us? By spying on us? By treating us like we're thieves? I turned to Philip, who was sitting there staring at his plate. Did you know? I asked. He wouldn't meet my eyes. That was answer enough. I demanded they pay me back. My father actually laughed. With what money? He said. Besides, good luck proving anything. That napkin isn't a legal contract. So what are you going to do, Harper? Sue us? Drag your own parents to court? You won't, because you care too much about what people think. He was right about one thing. I didn't sue them, not then. I was too devastated, too embarrassed, too caught up in this web of guilt that spent my whole life weaving around me. I drove home that night with my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the steering wheel. When I got to my apartment, I sat on the floor of my bathroom and cried for 3 days straight. I called in sick to work, which he'd never done. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every moment of my childhood, seeing it all through this new lens. Every accomplishment I'd achieved, every goal I'd reached, it had never been about me. It had been about them. About what I could provide. About what I was worth to them in dollars and cents. It never had parents who loved me. It had investors who'd been waiting for their return. The worst part was, even after all of that, I didn't cut them off. I considered it. I drafted emails and text messages telling them I was done, but I never sent them, because some pathetic part of me still hoped that maybe, just maybe, they'd realize what they'd done. Maybe they'd apologize. Maybe they'd finally love me the way I'd always needed them to. That hope nearly destroyed me. I started seeing my therapist twice a week instead of once. She was the one who helped me see the patterns I'd been blind to my entire life. She asked me to go through my bank records for the past 9 years and document every single time I'd given my parents money. It took me 3 sessions just to compile the list. When I was done, I sat there staring at the total, unable to process what I was seeing. $1.4 million. Over 9 years, I'd given my parents $1.4 million. That number didn't even include all the small stuff. The dinners I always paid for. The gifts I bought them for every holiday and birthday while they gave me cheap token items in return. The times I'd flown home to visit and covered all the expenses because they claimed they couldn't afford to see me otherwise. I broke it down into categories because that's what my finance brain needed to do to make sense of it. Emergency medical bills that I later discovered their insurance had actually covered. Home repairs that were never actually done. Philip's endless crises that they somehow always made my responsibility. Temporary loans that were never repaid. Investment opportunities that were really just lies. The pattern was clear once I could see it. Every time something good happened in my life, they'd have a crisis. Got a raise? Mom needed emergency dental work. Year-end bonus? Dad's car broke down? Paid off my student loans? Philip needed bail money. It was always something, always urgent, always my problem to solve. But the manipulation went so much deeper than just asking for money. They had this whole system perfected over decades. My mother's tactics were emotional. Shed cry, which she could do on command. Shed, give me the silent treatment for weeks if I disappointed her. Shed, tell other family members I was being difficult, painting herself as this suffering mother with an ungrateful daughter. Shed threatened to cut me out of her life, which terrified me more than I wanted to admit. My father's approach was different. He'd compare me to other people's daughters who were supposedly more successful or more generous. He'd make me feel like nothing I did was ever enough. He'd imply that I was selfish and cold for even hesitating when they needed help. He'd dangle his approval like a carrot I could never quite reach. And they worked together like a tag team. If I managed to say no to one of them, the other would call an hour later with a health crisis or some emergency that demanded immediate attention. They tracked my social media obsessively. They knew when I got promoted, when I traveled, when I bought anything nice for myself. They had this uncanny ability to ask for money right after my bonuses came through, which I eventually realized was because they'd been calling my office pretending to be me and asking about my compensation schedule. My assistant finally told me about it, uncomfortable about having given out the information. When I turned 30, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this. I was successful by every external measure, but I was miserable and broke despite making an excellent salary. I needed to set boundaries, or I was going to have a breakdown. I changed my phone number and only gave them my new one with strict instructions not to share it. I sent them a certified letter explaining that I would no longer be providing financial support, that they needed to figure out their own finances, and that I needed space to work on myself. I thought I was being clear and firm. I thought maybe they'd respect my boundaries. Instead, they showed up at my office building 2 days later. Security called me because my parents were in the lobby demanding to see me, causing a scene. My mother was crying dramatically, telling anyone who would listen that her daughter had abandoned her. My father was threatening to call the police and report me for elder abuse. I had to have security escort them out while my coworkers watched. I'd never been so humiliated in my life. But it didn't stop there. They started sending what I later learned are called flying monkeys. Aunts and uncles I barely knew called me to say I should be ashamed of myself. Cousins reached out on social media to tell me I was being cruel and unreasonable. Family friends I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly had opinions about my relationship with my parents. The narrative they'd spread was that I'd become this cold, successful career woman who'd forgotten where she came from, that I was too good for my own family now, that my mother was heartbroken and my father was disappointed, and poor Philip was caught in the middle. Some people believed them. Others, thankfully, had their own stories about my parents and saw right through it. My mother took to Facebook, posting these vague but pointed messages about heartless children and the sacrifices parents make. Share articles about elder abandonment and tag me in them. Post old photos of me as a child with captions like, "I miss my sweet girl, where did she go?" It was a full-scale smear campaign, and it was working on some people. But others started reaching out to me privately with their own experiences. A cousin told me my parents had borrowed $20,000 from her grandparents and never paid it back. An uncle mentioned they'd tried to get him to invest in one of my father's schemes years ago and had declined after doing research. A neighbor from my childhood told me she'd always felt uncomfortable with how they talked about me, like I was a commodity rather than a child. I wasn't the only victim, I was just the most lucrative one. For about 6 months, I held firm. I didn't respond to their messages, I didn't send money. I showed up to mandatory family events like Christmas with my boundaries intact. It was hard, but I was doing it. My therapist was proud of me. I was sleeping better. I was actually saving money for the first time in my adult life. Then, they did something I never expected. They apologized. It came via email, surprisingly formal and seemingly heartfelt. They said they understood they'd crossed lines. They recognized they'd been too dependent on me financially. They wanted to work on rebuilding our relationship without money being involved. They suggested monthly dinners at neutral locations where we could just be a family. I was skeptical, but I also desperately wanted to believe them, so I cautiously agreed. For 18 months, things were actually okay. We had dinner once a month at various restaurants. I always paid for the meals, but that seemed reasonable. We talked about surface-level things. They didn't ask me for money. They seemed to be respecting my boundaries. I started to hope that maybe we could have a real relationship after all. Maybe they'd finally changed. Maybe the boundaries had worked. Maybe we could be a normal family. I should have known better. People like my parents don't change. They just get better at hiding who they really are. And they were playing a long game I didn't even know had started. My maternal grandmother, Evelyn, died 2 months after my 31st birthday. She was 87 and had been declining for about a year. I was devastated. Grandma Evelyn had been the one person in my family who loved me unconditionally. I'd visit her every single week at her assisted living facility, not because I had to, but because I genuinely enjoyed her company. We'd drink tea and she'd tell me stories about her life, about immigrating to America, about building a business with my grandfather. She never asked me for anything. She just wanted my time and my company. In the last months of her life, when she was in hospice, I was there almost every day. I'd read to her, hold her hand, help the nurses care for her. My mother showed up maybe twice in those final weeks. She'd breeze in, stay for 20 minutes, spend most of that time on her phone, and then leave saying she had other obligations. At the funeral, I was crying so hard I could barely stand. My mother seemed distracted, checking her watch repeatedly. I overheard her asking my aunt when the will reading would be scheduled. Even in grief, she was thinking about money. The will reading took place a week later at the attorney's office. It was me, my parents, Philip, and a few of my mother's siblings. The lawyer, a kind older gentleman named Lawrence Mitchell, had been Grandma Evelyn's attorney for 30 years. He explained that my grandmother had been very specific about her wishes and had updated her will 6 months before her death while she was still completely sound of mind. The estate was substantial. The house Shed lived in before assisted living was worth about $700,000. She had investments and savings totaling approximately $1.6 million. Total estate value, roughly $2.3 million. My mother was literally on the edge of her seat. Then Lawrence read the will. Everything, every single penny and possession, was left to me. Not divided among her children and grandchildren. Not split between my mother and her siblings. Just me. There was a specific clause that explained why. Lawrence read it in my grandmother's words. I leave my entire estate to my granddaughter Harper because she is the only member of my family who visited me for who I am, not for what I have. Marianne has proven herself untrustworthy with money and relationships throughout her life. Harper has earned this through her character, her kindness, and her genuine love. The room exploded. My mother screamed, actually screamed, and threw her glass of water against the wall. She called me every name you can imagine, accused me of manipulating a dying old woman, said I'd poisoned Grandma Evelyn against her own daughter. My father sat there with his face turning purple, looking like he might have a stroke. Philip just stared at the floor. My aunt tried to calm my mother down, but she was beyond reason. She pointed at me and said, "You did this, you conniving little witch. You spent all that time with her just to get her money." That hurt more than anything else Shed ever said to me. Because it proved she could never understand that I'd loved my grandmother genuinely, that not everything was about money, that some relationships were real. Lawrence cleared his throat and continued reading. There was an additional clause. If anyone contested the will, their potential inheritance in any capacity would instead go to charity. It was an airtight document, witnessed by multiple parties, and filed properly. There was no legal ground to challenge it. My mother stormed out, my father following behind her. As he passed me, he leaned in and whispered, "You're going to regret this." After they left, Lawrence asked me to stay. He pulled out a box that had been in my grandmother's safe deposit box. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to me. Lawrence explained that Grandma Evelyn had left instructions for him to give these to me after her death. I took them home and spent the entire night reading them. They were dated over the past 5 years. In them, my grandmother detailed everything, how my mother had been calling her constantly asking for money, how Shed tried to turn Grandma Evelyn against me, telling lies about my life and my character. How Shed attempted to isolate my grandmother from me by telling her I was too busy to visit. How my father had tried to convince my grandmother to invest in his schemes multiple times. How Philip had shown up drunk once, demanding money for drugs. My grandmother had documented it all. Shed stayed quiet to keep the peace, but Shed been watching and recording everything. The final letter was dated 2 weeks before she died. It said, "My dearest Harper, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you more while I was alive, but I can protect you now. Your mother is ill, not in body but in spirit. She's incapable of real love. She sees people as tools. Please don't let guilt control you anymore. You owe them nothing. Take this money, build a beautiful life, and know that you were the greatest joy of my final years. You loved me when I had nothing left to give, and that's how I know your heart is pure. Be free, my darling girl, be free." I sat on my bedroom floor and sobbed until I had no tears left. My grandmother had given me more than money. Shed given me permission to let go of the guilt that had been crushing me my entire life. For about a week, I heard nothing from my parents. I thought maybe they'd finally accepted it, then the calls started. They demanded I share the inheritance. They said it was family money and I was being selfish keeping it all. They sent Philip to guilt-trip me, though he could barely look at me while he delivered their script about how hurt they were. I said no. The will was clear, and I was honoring my grandmother's wishes. That's when my father called and said the words that changed everything. "Well, make you regret this. You think you're so smart, but you're about to learn what happens when you disrespect your family. I changed my locks the next day. I installed security cameras around my apartment. I felt like I was preparing for war, and, in a way, I was. 3 weeks later, a process server showed up at my office with a court summons. My parents were suing me. The lawsuit was massive. They claimed I'd committed elder abuse by manipulating my grandmother. They claimed there was an oral contract where I'd promised to share any inheritance I received. They claimed I'd caused them severe emotional distress that had affected their health and well-being. They were suing for the full value of the inheritance plus my personal savings. Total demand, $3.8 million. They wanted to destroy me financially, and apparently felt completely justified in doing it. That's when I knew this was never going to end unless I ended it myself. I hired the best attorney I could find. Her name was Rosalind Barrett, and she had a reputation for being ruthless in family court. When I showed her the lawsuit and all my documentation, she looked up at me and said something I'll never forget. This is one of the clearest cases of financial abuse I've ever seen. But I need to warn you, family court can be unpredictable. Judges sometimes favor parents regardless of evidence. We need to be prepared for anything. I told her to do whatever it took. I was done being a victim. It was time to fight back. The discovery phase of the lawsuit was brutal. Both sides had to submit all relevant documents, and that meant exposing every detail of our family's financial history. I provided everything Rosalind asked for. Bank statements showing every transfer I'd ever made to my parents. Emails and text messages spanning years of manipulation and demands. The letters my grandmother had left me. Phone records showing the harassment. I felt like I was putting my entire life on display, but Rosalind assured me this was necessary. What we found during discovery made my blood run cold. My parents had hired a private investigator to follow me months before they filed the lawsuit. There were photos of me leaving my apartment, getting coffee, going to work, meeting friends for dinner. They'd been tracking my movements like I was some kind of criminal. They'd contacted my employer multiple times, pretending to be from various official agencies, trying to get information about my salary and bonuses. They'd even filed a false police report claiming I'd threatened them physically, though it was dismissed when I provided my doorbell camera footage showing I hadn't been to their house in over 8 months. This wasn't just a lawsuit. This was a coordinated attack designed to intimidate me into giving them what they wanted. But we found something else during discovery. Something even my attorney hadn't expected. My parents had a history of this behavior. Rosalind hired a forensic investigator who uncovered 3 other families who'd had similar experiences with my mother and father over the past 30 years. They'd befriend elderly people in their community, gain their trust, and then slowly manipulate them. In 2 cases, they'd successfully gotten themselves written into wills before the families caught on. In 1 case, there was a restraining order issued against them. They'd been doing this for decades, and my grandmother wasn't their first target within the family. She was just the first one who'd outsmarted them. When Rosalind showed me this information, I felt sick. These weren't just bad parents. These were predators who'd been operating in plain sight my entire life. Everything I'd thought about my childhood was a lie. Every memory was tainted. The worst part was realizing that if my grandmother hadn't left me everything, if she'd split it among the family like most people do, my parents would have gotten away with it again. They'd have taken their cut and moved on to the next target. I was only in this position because my grandmother had been brave enough to break the cycle. Then, something unexpected happened. Philip reached out to me. We hadn't spoken since the will reading, and I assumed he was firmly on our parents' side. He sent me a text asking if we could meet somewhere private. I was suspicious, but I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop, far from anywhere our parents might be. When he walked in, I barely recognized him. He looked terrible, thin, exhausted, like he hadn't slept in weeks. He sat down across from me and immediately started crying. "I can't do this anymore," he said. "I can't be part of this." Then he told me everything. Our parents had been planning this lawsuit for over a year, since before Grandma Evelyn even died. They'd already contacted lawyers and discussed their strategy. The plan was always to get the inheritance one way or another. When the will turned out to be airtight, they pivoted to suing me directly. They'd promised Philip $500,000 if the lawsuit was successful. His role was to testify against me, to say that I'd always been manipulative and controlling, that I'd isolated grandmother from the family, that I'd threatened him and our parents multiple times. They'd coached him on what to say, how to cry on command, how to make it believable, but he couldn't go through with it. Philip told me he'd been sober for 2 months, his longest stretch in years, and getting clean had made him see things clearly for the first time. He realized our parents had been using both of us our entire lives. They'd pitted us against each other, made us compete for their approval, assigned us roles in their sick dynamic, me as the golden child who had to be perfect and provide, him as the scapegoat who could never do anything right. Neither of us had ever been loved for who we were. We'd been cast in parts in their twisted play, and we'd both been suffering because of it. "I'm so sorry," he said, over and over. "I'm so sorry for every time they sent me to ask you for money. I'm so sorry for not standing up for you. I'm so sorry for everything. I didn't know if I could trust him. Had hurt me so many times before, enabled our parents' behavior, benefited from my suffering." But something in his eyes was different. He was finally seeing them for what they were, and that awareness was destroying him the same way it had destroyed me. I asked him if he'd be willing to testify for me instead of against me. He said yes without hesitation. That's when I knew he was serious. Rosalind was skeptical about using Philip as a witness. His history with substances would make him easy to discredit, and our parents' attorney would definitely use that against him. But I insisted. I told her that his testimony would show the pattern, would prove that I wasn't the only victim, would demonstrate how our parents operated. She reluctantly agreed, but warned me that it could backfire. As we prepared for trial, more evidence kept surfacing. Rosalind's investigator found records of our parents attempting to access my bank accounts using forged documents. The bank had caught it and flagged it, but never prosecuted. There were recordings of phone calls where my mother had tried to impersonate me to get information from my financial advisor. There were emails between my parents discussing various strategies to get what we deserve from Harper. Every piece of evidence painted the same picture. This wasn't about an inheritance dispute. This was about two people who viewed their own daughter as a resource to be exploited, and when she finally said no, they decided to destroy her. The strategy Rosalind developed was simple but risky. We'd let my parents present their case first. She was confident they'd overreach, make claims they couldn't support, let their true nature show. Then we'd systematically dismantle their case with evidence. Philip's testimony would be emotional and damaging. And finally, I would take the stand and tell my story directly to the judge. It was a gamble, but I trusted her. The week before the trial, I barely slept. I had panic attacks almost daily. My therapist had me on a crisis schedule, seeing her every other day, but I also had something I'd never had before: real support. 3 of my closest friends from college cleared their schedules to be there every day of the trial. They'd sit in the gallery behind me, a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. Philip had moved into a sober living facility and was doing intensive therapy. He called me every night to check in, to promise he wouldn't let me down this time. For the first time in my life, I had people who cared about me without wanting something in return. That realization gave me strength. I thought about my grandmother's last letter constantly. "Be free, my darling girl. Be free." This trial wasn't just about money or justice. It was about breaking chains that had been wrapped around me since birth. It was about standing up and saying enough. It was about choosing myself for once in my life. So, when the trial date finally arrived, I walked into that courthouse with my head held high. I was terrified, yes. But I was also ready to tell the truth, ready to face them, ready to be free. The courthouse in Hartford was imposing, all marble columns and echoing hallways that made every whisper sound like a judgment. It was early March, and there was still a bite in the air as I walked up the steps with Rosalind beside me. The press had somehow gotten wind of the case. Local news crews were set up outside, though Rosalind had managed to keep them from identifying me by name. The headline was juicy enough without details. "Parents sue daughter for millions in inheritance dispute." Inside, the courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, but still intimidating. Dark wood paneling, high ceilings, that strange smell of old paper and furniture polish that all legal buildings seem to have. The judge's bench loomed at the front, the Connecticut state seal mounted behind it. My parents were already there, sitting at the plaintiff's table with their attorney. My mother wore a conservative navy dress and pearls, her hair styled perfectly. She'd clearly been crying, her eyes red and puffy. My father sat stiffly in a dark suit, his jaw clenched. They'd dressed the part of grieving, wronged parents perfectly. Their attorney, Maxwell Gorman, was exactly what you'd expect. Expensive suit, slicked-back hair, aggressive reputation. Head made his career on high-profile family disputes and had a win record that was genuinely impressive. Id looked him up obsessively in the weeks leading up to trial. The gallery was surprisingly full. Extended family members, most of whom I hadn't seen in years, filled the rows behind my parents. I recognized aunts and uncles, a few cousins, even some of my parents' neighbors. They were there to support my mother and father, to witness what they believed would be my public shaming. Behind me sat my 3 friends from college, steadfast and loyal. Philip sat at the end of the row, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He looked like he might be sick, but head shone up. That meant everything. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and everyone stood as the judge entered. Honorable Ruth Brennan was in her early 60s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a bun. She had a reputation for being brilliant, fair, and utterly no-nonsense. She didn't tolerate games in her courtroom, which Rosalind said could work in our favor. Judge Brennan settled into her chair, reviewed the case file briefly, and then looked out at both tables. This is a bench trial in the matter of Marianne and Gerald Patterson versus Harper Patterson. Both parties have waived their right to a jury. I've reviewed the initial filings. Mr. Gorman, you may proceed with your opening statement. Maxwell Gorman stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and approached the bench with the confidence of someone who'd never lost. His opening statement was a masterclass in manipulation. He painted a picture of loving parents who'd sacrificed everything for their children. He described how they'd worked multiple jobs to provide a good life for Harper and Philip, how they'd supported Harper's education and career, how they'd been there for every milestone and achievement. Then he pivoted to my grandmother, describing her as elderly and vulnerable in her final years. He claimed that I'd systematically isolated her from my mother, her only child. That I'd used my financial expertise to manipulate her into believing her daughter was untrustworthy with money. That I'd essentially engaged in elder abuse to secure an inheritance that should have been my mother's. He presented the oral contract claim, saying that at multiple family gatherings, I'd explicitly promised that if I ever received significant money, I'd share it with the family. He had witnesses prepared to testify to this, he said. He described the emotional devastation my parents had suffered, how my mother had fallen into a depression, how my father's health had declined from stress, how I'd cut them off completely, refusing to even speak to them. He demanded the full value of the inheritance plus damages for emotional distress. His voice crescendoed at the end. Your Honor, what we have here is a daughter who has forgotten the most basic principles of family and gratitude. She stands to gain millions while the parents who gave her everything are left with nothing. This court has the power to right this wrong, to restore what was taken, and to send a message that family bonds still matter in our society. It was effective. I could see some of the people in the gallery nodding along. Even Judge Brennan's expression was unreadable, which terrified me. When Gorman sat down, my mother reached over and squeezed his hand, a gesture clearly meant for the judge to see. Then, it was Rosalind's turn. She stood calmly, walked to the center of the courtroom, and began speaking in a clear, measured voice. No theatrics, no emotional appeals, just facts. She outlined the true nature of my relationship with my parents. The decades of financial exploitation. The $1.4 million I'd given them over the years. The $500,000 they'd stolen from me. The systematic manipulation and guilt. She explained that my grandmother's will was carefully crafted by a woman of sound mind, specifically to protect me from further abuse. She promised to present evidence of my parents' pattern of targeting elderly individuals for financial gain. She explained that this lawsuit itself was just another form of exploitation, an attempt to use the legal system to continue controlling and extracting money from their daughter. Her closing was simple. Your Honor, this case is not about a generous inheritance or family obligations. It's about two people who view their own daughter as an ATM machine, and when that machine stopped dispensing cash, they decided to sue. The evidence will show a clear pattern of financial abuse spanning decades. We ask that you dismiss this case with prejudice and award my client the legal fees she has incurred defending herself against this baseless claim. The first witness for the plaintiffs was my mother. She walked to the stand like she was going to her own funeral, moving slowly, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She swore to tell the truth, sat down, and immediately began her performance. Under Gorman's questioning, she described what she claimed was a loving childhood home, how she and my father had scrimped and saved to give us everything we needed, how proud they were when I succeeded academically and professionally. She talked about my grandmother with reverence, describing their supposedly close relationship. Then she started crying harder as she talked about the will reading. How shocked she was, how betrayed she felt, how she couldn't understand how her own mother could do this to her. Harper was always at Mom's house in those final months, she said, her voice breaking. I couldn't visit as often because of my health issues. I think Harper took advantage of that time to turn Mom against me. My mother would never have done this on her own. She described our relationship as strained, claiming it'd always been difficult and distant. She said Eid promised multiple times at family gatherings that Eid always take care of them. She painted herself as this heartbroken mother who just wanted her daughter back. It was a convincing performance if you didn't know the truth. Then came the cross-examination. Rosalind stood up, and I could see a slight smile on her face. She started with simple questions, establishing timeline and facts. When did my mother last visit her own mother? Marianne said Shed visited regularly. Rosalind pulled out the visitor logs from the assisted living facility. In the final year of my grandmother's life, my mother had visited exactly 4 times. I had visited 73 times. My mother stammered, said the logs must be wrong. Rosalind moved on. She asked about the money he'd given them over the years. My mother tried to downplay it, said those were gifts, that's what families do. Rosalind presented bank statements showing the amounts and frequency. She asked my mother to explain how people who supposedly needed constant financial help had taken 3 vacations to Europe in the past 5 years. My mother said they'd saved up. Rosalind showed credit card statements proving the trips were paid for by money I'd sent them for supposed emergencies. With every question, my mother's composure cracked a little more. She got defensive, then angry, then tried to play the victim again. Judge Brennan was watching intently, her pen moving across her notepad. By the time my mother stepped down, the veneer of the suffering parent had cracked, and glimpses of her real personality had shown through. My father was next, and he was more composed but ultimately less sympathetic. He played the disappointed patriarch, the man who'd worked hard his whole life only to be betrayed by his own daughter. But Rosalind destroyed him with financial records. She showed how Head claimed poverty while driving a car worth $78,000. She presented evidence of his gambling habits. She got him to admit there had never been any real estate investment. He got angry on the stand, his face turning red, his voice rising. Judge Brennan had to warn him twice about his courtroom demeanor. It wasn't going well for them, but they still had more witnesses prepared. This was just the beginning. The second day of trial began with my parents' third witness, a psychologist named Dr. Warren Finch who specialized in elder care. Gorman had hired him to provide expert testimony about my grandmother's state of mind and vulnerability to manipulation. Dr. Finch had never met my grandmother, never examined her, never reviewed her medical records. His entire testimony was based on a hypothetical profile that Gorman had created. He testified that elderly individuals in assisted living facilities are often isolated and vulnerable to manipulation by family members who visit frequently. He suggested that someone with financial expertise, like me, would know exactly how to exploit an elderly person's cognitive decline. He used terms like undue influence and predatory relationship to describe what he claimed I'd done. It sounded convincing until Rosalind stood up for cross-examination. She immediately established that Dr. Finch had never met my grandmother and was testifying purely on speculation. She asked about his fee for this testimony. $25,000. She asked how many times Head testified in cases where Maxwell Gorman was the attorney. 17 times. She pulled out his professional review records showing multiple complaints about providing biased testimony for money. By the time she was done, Dr. Finch's credibility was demolished. Judge Brennan sustained nearly every objection Rosalind had made during his direct testimony, and I could see her making notes that looked distinctly unfavorable. Gorman called 2 more witnesses, both neighbors of my parents, who testified that Id promised at various gatherings to always take care of my family. Under cross-examination, Rosalind got them to admit they'd never actually heard me make these specific promises. They'd heard my parents talk about what Id supposedly said, but they'd never witnessed it directly. It was hearsay, and Judge Brennan noted that clearly. By the afternoon of the second day, the plaintiffs rested their case. It felt weaker than I'd hoped, but still dangerous. Family court can be unpredictable, and my parents had played their roles well enough that some doubt might linger. Now it was our turn. Rosalind's first witness was Lawrence Mitchell, my grandmother's attorney. Head handled her legal affairs for 30 years and had personally drafted her final will. He testified that my grandmother had been completely sound of mind when she made her decisions. He described multiple meetings they'd had where she explicitly discussed her reasons for leaving everything to me. He explained the protective clause Shed insisted on, designed specifically to prevent my mother from contesting the will. Most importantly, he testified that my grandmother had insisted I not be present for any discussions about the will. She wanted it to be a pure surprise, completely untainted by any possibility that Id influenced her. Head brought detailed notes from their meetings, including quotes from my grandmother. "Marianne has taken enough from me and from Harper. This is my way of protecting my granddaughter from future exploitation." Gorman tried to suggest that Lawrence had helped me manipulate my grandmother, but it fell flat. Lawrence had impeccable credentials and reputation. Head even brought a video recording of one of their meetings, something my grandmother had requested he make to prevent any future disputes. In the video, my grandmother, clearly coherent and sharp, explained her reasoning. She detailed years of my mother asking for money, telling lies about me, trying to isolate her from her granddaughter. She expressed fear that if she split the inheritance, my parents would manipulate me into giving them my share. The video was devastating to my parents' case. I watched my mother's face as it played. Shed gone pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table. The next witness was Patricia Donovan, the manager at my bank. She testified about the incident where my father had attempted to access my accounts using forged documents. She brought surveillance footage showing him at the bank, trying to sweet-talk a teller into giving him access to my safe deposit box. She detailed multiple phone calls from my mother, impersonating me, trying to get account information and balances. The bank had a file of concerning incidents documenting what she called financial stalking. Gorman tried to minimize it, but the evidence was clear and documented. Then Rosalind called a family friend, Lucille Hammond, who'd known my parents for 35 years. Lucille was clearly uncomfortable testifying, but Shed agreed because her conscience demanded it. She testified about my parents' history as social climbers, always trying to associate with wealthier families in the community. She described witnessing them pressure me for money at her daughter's wedding. I'd completely forgotten about that incident, but she remembered it clearly. Shed overheard my mother say to another guest, "Harper is finally paying off. We invested 18 years in raising her, and now we're seeing returns." The courtroom went silent. Even Judge Brennan looked shocked. Lucille went on to describe 2 other elderly individuals in the community that my parents had befriended and later were accused of financially exploiting. One had filed a complaint with Adult Protective Services before passing away. Under cross-examination, Gorman tried to paint Lucille as having a grudge against my parents, but she held firm. She said she was testifying because Shed stayed silent too long and regretted it. Then came the moment I'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Philip took the stand. My brother looked small sitting in the witness box. Head lost weight since getting sober, and his clothes hung loose on his frame. But his eyes were clear for the first time in years. Rosalind was gentle with him, knowing he was fragile but crucial. Philip testified about our childhood from his perspective as the scapegoat child. How nothing he did was ever good enough. How he was constantly compared to me and found lacking. How our parents pitted us against each other, using me as the standard he could never meet. Then he talked about his role in their schemes. How they'd coach him to ask me for money, promising they'd reimburse him later and he could keep a percentage. How every time he went to rehab, it was my name on the checks while they spent the equivalent amount on themselves. He described the planning meetings for this lawsuit, held in our parents' dining room. He recounted my mother saying, "Harper owes us. We made her who she is. That money should be ours." He described my father saying, "She's selfish with our money. She's always been selfish." Then Philip broke down completely. Through tears he said, "I let them use me to hurt my sister. I took money from Harper knowing it was destroying her. I watched them abuse her for years and I did nothing because I was getting scraps from the table. I'm so sorry, Harper. I'm so sorry for everything." Gorman's cross-examination was brutal. He attacked Philip's credibility, bringing up his history with substances, his criminal record for possession, his time in and out of rehabilitation facilities. He suggested Philip was lying to get back in my good graces, maybe hoping I'd support him financially again, but Philip held steady. He admitted all his failures, owned his past mistakes, and said that's exactly why he had to testify. Because he knew what it was like to be under our parents' control, to feel like you'd do anything for their approval, and he couldn't watch me be victimized anymore. His rawness, his obvious pain and guilt, seemed to resonate in the courtroom. Even Judge Brennan's expression softened slightly. After Philip, Rosalind called my therapist, Dr. Sharon Wells. I'd given permission for her to testify, waiving confidentiality for this purpose. Dr. Wells explained the psychological impact of long-term financial exploitation and emotional abuse. She described my PTSD symptoms, my struggles with anxiety and depression, my difficulty trusting people. She testified about the concept of parentification, where a child is forced into the role of provider and caretaker for their own parents. She explained how this had shaped my entire personality and worldview. Gorman objected repeatedly, claiming this wasn't relevant, but Judge Brennan allowed most of it. She seemed genuinely interested in understanding the psychological dynamics at play. Finally, Rosalind presented the documentary evidence. Bankers, boxes full of printed emails, text messages, bank statements, receipts, every transaction ID ever made to my parents, categorized and analyzed. The pattern was undeniable. Every time something good happened in my life, they'd have an emergency. Every bonus, every promotion, every success was followed immediately by a crisis that required my money. The private investigators' report they'd commissioned was particularly damning. Photos of me going about my daily life, notes about my routine, speculation about my assets. It was obsessive and creepy. The false police report they'd filed was entered into evidence. The forged bank documents. Everything that showed this wasn't about a loving family dispute. This was about control, exploitation, and retaliation for my daring to say no. By the time we finished presenting evidence, it was late afternoon on the third day of trial. Judge Brennan looked tired but alert. She turned to me and asked if I wished to testify. Rosalind nodded to me. This was it. My chance to tell my story in my own words. I stood up, my legs shaking, and walked to the witness stand. I swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Then I sat down, looked directly at my parents across the courtroom, and began to speak. Rosalind asked me to start from the beginning, to tell the court about my childhood and my relationship with my parents. My voice was steady, surprisingly so. I'd cried so much over the past months that I had no tears left. I just had truth. I described growing up as what appeared from the outside to be the golden child, the achiever, the one who made my parents proud. But I explained what that really meant. It meant that my worth was entirely conditional on my performance. Every accomplishment was met with what's next instead of celebration. Every achievement raised the bar higher. I was never good enough, never successful enough, never giving enough. I told the court about my first memory involving money. I was 12 years old and won a science fair with a prize of $500. I was so excited, thinking maybe I'd buy books or art supplies. My mother asked for the money that same day, said she'd save it for my college fund. I never saw it again, and when I asked about it years later, she had no memory of it. That was the first time I learned my accomplishments weren't about me. They were about what they could extract from them. I described high school, working multiple part-time jobs while maintaining perfect grades. How every dollar I earned somehow ended up going to family expenses. I described college, having a full scholarship but still struggling to afford books and food because my parents would call with emergencies. I worked 3 jobs during college, while carrying a full course load. I lived on ramen noodles and slept 4 hours a night. Meanwhile, my parents took a vacation to Florida with money they'd borrowed from me for property taxes. I told the court about graduation day, how my parents asked me to pay for the celebration dinner. It cost $400, money I'd been saving for my security deposit on my first apartment. I paid it because I thought that's what you did for family. I thought if I just gave enough, did enough, succeeded enough, eventually they'd love me for me, not for what I could provide. I was wrong. I explained my early career, every promotion and bonus somehow immediately known to my parents. How I later discovered they'd been calling my office, monitoring my LinkedIn, even befriending my coworkers to get information about my compensation. Every success was followed immediately by a crisis that required my money. It was so consistent it couldn't possibly be coincidence. They were timing their emergencies to match my financial victories. Rosalind asked me about the $500,000 investment. My voice got harder here, flatter. I explained the months of pressure, the crying, the guilt-tripping, the manipulation. How I finally gave in because I wanted so desperately to believe they'd changed, that we could have a real family relationship. I described discovering they'd stolen it, spent it on luxury items and vacations, and paying off my brother's debts. I told the court about the confrontation at their house, my father laughing and saying it was family money anyway, challenging me to sue them because I wouldn't. That was the moment I finally understood. I said, looking directly at Judge Brennan. It never had parents who loved me. It had predators who were patient. They'd spent 18 years raising me not as a daughter but as an investment, and they felt completely entitled to their returns. I saw some people in the gallery shift uncomfortably. My mother was staring at the table, her face flushed. Rosalind asked me why I'd continued giving them money even after that betrayal. Why I hadn't cut them off sooner. This was the question I'd been dreading because the answer made me feel weak. But I told the truth. Because I kept hoping. I said, I kept hoping that if I gave enough, did enough, succeeded enough, they'd finally love me. Not my bank account, me. I was trying to buy love that was never for sale because they had none to give. The courtroom was completely silent. I could hear someone crying softly in the gallery. I continued, describing my relationship with my grandmother. How Evelyn was the only person who'd ever loved me unconditionally. How I'd visit her every week, not because I wanted something from her, but because I genuinely enjoyed her company. How Shed never asked me for anything except my time. When she got sick, I was there every day because I wanted to be, because she mattered to me. My mother visited her own mother exactly 4 times in that final year, I said. She showed up at the will, reading expecting to inherit, having done nothing to earn it. She's spent my entire life telling me that family is everything, that we have to take care of each other. But when it came time for her to take care of her own mother, she was nowhere to be found. That's because, to my mother, family isn't about love or loyalty. It's about what she can get. I described the will reading my mother's explosive reaction, her immediate accusations that I'd manipulated my grandmother. I explained how my grandmother had protected me the only way she could, by ensuring I had financial security that my parents couldn't touch. Grandma Evelyn gave me permission to stop sacrificing myself. I said, she gave me permission to say no. And that's what made my parents so angry. Not that they didn't get the money, but that they'd lost control over me. Rosalind asked about the harassment that followed. I detailed the showing up at my office, the social media campaign, the flying monkeys they'd sent to guilt-trip me, the months of pressure and manipulation. Then I talked about the brief period of peace, the 18 months where they seemed to respect my boundaries. I thought maybe they'd finally changed, I said. I thought maybe we could have a real relationship, but they were just playing a long game. They were waiting, being patient, making me believe things were better, all while they were planning this lawsuit behind my scenes. My own parents hired a private investigator to stalk me. They forged documents to try to access my bank accounts. They filed a false police report against me. This wasn't about reconciliation. This was a strategic operation to get what they felt they were owed. I looked at my parents then, really looked at them. My mother was crying, but the tears looked performative. My father's jaw was clenched, his hands fisted on the table. You're not suing me for money, I said directly to them. You're suing me because I finally said no, because I finally chose myself. And you can't stand it, you can't stand that I'm no longer under your control. Rosalind asked me what I wanted from this trial. I thought about that question carefully before answering. I want the truth on record, I said. I want my brother to be free to heal without their manipulation. I want to stop other people from becoming their victims, and I want them to know that they don't own me. They never did, they never will. Rosalind nodded and said she had one final question. Is there anything else the court should know about the plaintiff's behavior? I took a deep breath. This was the bombshell we'd been saving. Yes, I said. 3 weeks ago, my mother left me a voicemail. She thought Shed hung up, but the recording continued for another 3 minutes. I'd like the court to hear it. Rosalind asked the judge for permission to play the recording. Gorman objected strenuously, but Judge Brennan overruled him. She wanted to hear it. The courtroom audio system crackled to life. My mother's voice filled the space, crystal clear. At first, it was a typical guilt trip message about how hurt she was, how disappointed. Then came the sound of her apparently putting the phone down, not realizing it was still recording. Her voice became distant but audible. Gerald, I just left Harper another message. The trial is in a few weeks, my father's voice responded. Good. Once we get her money, we never have to pretend to tolerate her again. My mother laughed. Actually laughed. Thank God. She's always been exhausting anyway. Too sensitive, too emotional. I don't know how we raised such a weak child. My father said something I couldn't quite make out. Then my mother's voice came through clearly again. Should have had the smart one without the annoying personality. At least then, the investment would have paid off without all the drama. More laughter from both of them. Then the sound of the call finally disconnecting. The courtroom erupted. People were gasping, talking over each other. Judge Brennan had to bang her gavel 3 times to restore order. I watched my mother's face go from pink to white to a splotchy red. My father was staring at the table like he could burn a hole through it with his eyes. Several family members who'd been sitting behind my parents stood up and walked out, looks of disgust on their faces. Judge Brennan's face had gone pale. She looked at my parents with an expression of pure revulsion, then turned back to me with something that looked almost like compassion. No further questions, Your Honor, Rosalind said quietly. I stepped down from the witness stand on shaking legs and walked back to my table. As I passed my parents, my mother tried to speak. Harper, that's not what it— Judge Brennan cut her off with a sharp, "Sit down, Mrs. Patterson." My mother shut her mouth and sank back into her chair, finally, mercifully silent. Gorman's closing argument was half-hearted at best. He tried to argue that the voicemail was taken out of context, that emotions were running high, that it didn't negate the legitimate concerns about the will and my grandmother's vulnerability. He talked about the importance of family unity and forgiveness. He suggested that perhaps the inheritance could be split more equitably through the court's intervention, but the energy had gone out of his performance. Even he seemed to know it was over. Rosalind's closing was powerful and concise. She summarized the pattern of exploitation spanning decades. She highlighted the documentary evidence showing systematic financial abuse. She played key excerpts of testimony, including Philip's emotional breakdown and my grandmother's video explaining her reasoning. Then she addressed the voicemail recording. Your Honor, that recording reveals the truth that my client has known her entire life but struggled to accept. Her parents don't love her. They tolerate her because she's profitable. The moment they secure her money, they plan to discard her. This lawsuit isn't about an inheritance dispute. It's about 2 people who have spent 3 decades exploiting their daughter and are now using the legal system for one final extraction. We ask that you dismiss this case with prejudice, award my client her legal fees, and consider a restraining order to protect her from further harassment. Judge Brennan announced a 20-minute recess to deliberate. Those 20 minutes felt like hours. I sat with Rosalind, holding her hand under the table. My friends surrounded me in the gallery. Philip sat with his head in his hands. When Judge Brennan returned, the courtroom went silent. She settled into her chair, adjusted her glasses, and began to read from her written decision. I have been on the bench for 40 years, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the space. I have presided over hundreds of family disputes. But I have never, in my entire career, seen such a clear case of financial exploitation masquerading as parental love. She went through the evidence systematically, the bank records showing $1.4 million in transfers over 9 years, the $500,000 theft, the pattern of manipulation, my grandmother's meticulous documentation of her reasons for the will, the video recording of her explaining her decision while clearly of sound mind, the voicemail revealing my parents' true intentions. The plaintiffs have presented no credible evidence that the defendant manipulated her grandmother, Judge Brennan continued. To the contrary, the evidence shows that Evelyn Patterson was protecting her granddaughter from the very behavior the plaintiffs are exhibiting in this courtroom. The will was carefully crafted, properly witnessed, and reflects the testator's clear intent. She dismissed the lawsuit entirely, with prejudice, meaning it could never be filed again. She ruled that I owed my parents nothing, and that the inheritance was legally and morally mine. Then she went further. I am ordering the plaintiffs to pay the defendant's legal fees, she said. Rosalind squeezed my hand. Our fees totaled $83,000. Additionally, I am issuing a restraining order requiring the plaintiffs to maintain a distance of no less than 500 feet from the defendant at all times, with no direct or indirect contact permitted. But she wasn't done. Furthermore, I am referring this case to the state attorney's office for possible criminal prosecution regarding the forged bank documents, the false police report, and potential fraud charges related to the systematic exploitation documented in this case. The behavior exhibited by the plaintiffs represents elder abuse, financial abuse of their own child, and abuse of the legal system. I am also directing the court clerk to forward this decision to Adult Protective Services, as the evidence suggests a pattern of targeting vulnerable elderly individuals that extends beyond this family. She looked directly at my parents. You should be ashamed of yourselves, she said, her voice hard. You have spent decades exploiting a daughter who only wanted your love. You have tried to use this courtroom to continue that exploitation. You have failed. This court will not be a tool for your abuse. The gavel came down with a final, decisive crack. It was over. My parents sat frozen at their table. Gorman was already packing his briefcase, clearly eager to distance himself from the disaster. People in the gallery were talking in shocked whispers. I felt Rosalind put her arm around my shoulders. You won, she said simply. It's over. I started crying then, not from sadness but from relief. 3 decades of weight lifted off my shoulders in that moment. The judge's words had validated everything I'd been too afraid to fully acknowledge. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't ungrateful. I wasn't a bad daughter. I was a survivor. My parents left the courtroom through a side door, surrounded by reporters shouting questions. They refused to comment, their faces hidden behind raised hands. Several family members who'd supported them were notably absent as they made their exit. The ones who'd walked out earlier after the voicemail were reportedly telling anyone who'd listened that they'd had no idea how bad things were. Rosalind and I left through a different exit with Philip and my friends. Outside, the March air felt different somehow, cleaner. I could breathe fully for the first time in years. Over the following months, life began to change in ways I couldn't have imagined. The state attorney did press charges against my parents for fraud and filing false reports. They eventually pleaded guilty to lesser charges, avoiding jail time but receiving probation, significant fines, and mandatory financial counseling. The legal fees I'd won plus the fines essentially bankrupted them. Their house went up for sale. Some petty part of me felt satisfaction at that, though mostly I just felt sad for the family we could have been but never were. Philip stayed in sober living for 6 months, then moved into a modest apartment. I helped him pay for a 90-day intensive rehab program, but this time it was my choice, given freely without pressure or manipulation. He worked the program seriously, stayed sober, and got a job in construction. We started having weekly dinners, slowly rebuilding a sibling relationship based on honesty instead of our parents' manipulation. He never asked me for money again. When he needed help, he asked for advice or support, not cash. It was a complete transformation. He told me once, with tears in his eyes, that getting sober had saved his life, but learning the truth about our parents had freed him. He'd spent his whole life thinking he was the broken one. Now he understood the system itself had been broken from the start. I continued therapy, working through the trauma of 3 decades of emotional and financial abuse. Dr. Wells helped me understand that healing wasn't linear, that I'd have good days and bad days, that sometimes I'd still feel guilty for protecting myself, and that was normal. I joined a support group for adult children of narcissistic parents. Finding a community of people with similar stories was incredibly healing. I wasn't alone. So many people had experienced variations of what I'd been through. We supported each other, celebrated boundaries, and worked together on breaking cycles of generational trauma. About 8 months after the trial, I started a blog about financial exploitation in families. I wrote anonymously at first, sharing my story and the red flags people should watch for. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people reached out with their own experiences. I started doing advocacy work, speaking to social workers and elder care facilities about recognizing financial abuse. My grandmother's legacy wasn't just the money shed left me. It was the voice shed given me to help protect others. I met Garrett at a friend's party about a year after the trial. He worked in education, taught middle school science, and had never heard about my case or my money. He knew me just as Harper, slightly awkward at parties, passionate about helping others, still learning to trust. We talked for hours that first night about everything except finances. He made me laugh. He listened when I talked. He didn't try to fix me or save me, he just accepted me. I was cautious at first, my trust issues making every step forward feel terrifying. But Garrett was patient. He was consistent. He showed up when he said he would. He respected my boundaries. He got excited about the small things I'd never thought mattered, like my love of terrible reality TV or my habit of making elaborate pancakes on Sunday mornings. 6 months into our relationship, I told him everything. About my parents, the lawsuit, the money, all of it. I was terrified he'd run or see me differently. Instead, he held my hand and said, "Thank you for trusting me with your story. It doesn't change how I feel about you. If anything, it makes me admire you more for surviving it and still being kind." A year later, he proposed with a simple silver band head saved up for on his teacher's salary. It wasn't expensive or flashy, and that made it perfect. He loved me for me, not for what I could provide. I said yes immediately. The wedding was small and intimate, held in a garden on a perfect June afternoon. Philip walked me down the aisle, both of us crying happy tears. My 3 college friends stood up as bridesmaids. Garrett's warm, loving family embraced me completely, showing me what healthy family relationships looked like. There were no empty seats where my parents should have been. Just people who genuinely cared about me, celebrating because they wanted to, not because they wanted something from me. 2 years after the trial, my mother violated the restraining order. She showed up at my workplace lobby, asking security to tell me she needed to speak with me. Security called the police, but I agreed to 5 minutes in a public space with officers present. She looked older than her years, worn down by consequences for the first time in her life. "I came to apologize," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. I asked her what exactly she was apologizing for. She stammered, tried several starts, but couldn't articulate specific actions or impacts. Instead, she blamed stress, bad advice from their lawyer, miscommunication, anything but taking real accountability. "I think we all made mistakes," she said finally. "But we're family. We should move past this." I looked at this woman who'd given birth to me, but had never really been my mother. I felt pity more than anger. "I forgive you," I said. "Not for you, but for me. Because carrying anger was hurting me more than it was hurting you. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. We're done. Don't contact me again." I walked away and never looked back. The police escorted her off the property and documented the violation. I could have had her arrested, but I didn't. That chapter was closed. I didn't need revenge. I just needed her gone from my life. I've thought a lot about what I learned from all of this. The biggest lesson was that you can't buy love. You can't earn it through achievement or sacrifice or giving until you have nothing left. Real love is freely given, or it isn't love at all. My worth isn't in my bank account or my accomplishments. It's intrinsic, just by virtue of being human, of being me. My grandmother taught me that. She loved me when I was a broke college student eating ramen, and she loved me when I was a successful finance professional. The amount in my bank account never changed how she felt about me. That's what real love looks like. I also learned that breaking free from toxic family is painful but necessary. We're taught that family is everything, that blood is thicker than water, that we have to maintain those relationships no matter what. But that's not true. Some families are toxic. Some parents are abusive. And protecting yourself from abuse isn't selfish, even when the abusers are your parents. It's survival. My wedding day was small but filled with people I'd chosen, people who'd chosen me back. That's my real family. Philip, sober and healing. My 3 college friends who stood by me through everything. Garrett and his wonderful parents who showed me what healthy love looks like. The friends I've made through advocacy work. The chosen family I built based on mutual respect and genuine care. That's what family should be. My career continues to thrive, but I measure success differently now. It's not just about the next promotion or the bigger bonus. Success is setting boundaries and maintaining them. Success is having authentic relationships where I'm valued for who I am, not what I provide. Success is breaking the cycle of generational trauma, so that if Garrett and I have children someday, they'll grow up knowing they're loved unconditionally. Success is knowing my worth beyond the dollars. I still live comfortably but not extravagantly. The inheritance my grandmother left me is invested wisely, generating income that I use partly for myself and partly to fund financial literacy programs and support groups for abuse survivors. That feels like the right way to honor her legacy. She gave me freedom. I'm using that freedom to help free others. Every time I speak at an event or respond to someone's email about their own family struggles, I think about my grandmother's last letter to me. Be free, my darling girl. Be free. I am free now. Free from obligation that was really exploitation. Free from guilt that was really manipulation. Free from the exhausting effort of trying to earn love from people who had none to give. Free to be myself, flawed and imperfect, and enough just as I am. Standing in my home now, the one I share with Garrett, I feel peace for the first time in my life. There's a photo of grandmother Evelyn on the mantle, her smile captured in a moment of genuine joy. Garrett is in the kitchen making dinner, singing off-key to the radio. Philip is coming over tonight for our weekly dinner. This is what life looks like on the other side of survival. It's quiet and ordinary and absolutely beautiful. Sometimes, the family you're born into teaches you exactly who you don't want to be, and that lesson, painful as it is, sets you free to become who you're meant to be. My parents taught me what love isn't. My grandmother taught me what love is. And now I get to live in that truth every single day. The courtroom victory was important. The judge's words validated my experience and protected me legally. But the real victory was internal. It was the moment I finally believed I deserved better. It was choosing myself even when it meant losing the parents I'd always wished I had. It was accepting that some relationships can't be fixed, and that's okay. That's not failure. That's wisdom. I'm 34 now, happily married, building a life based on truth and genuine connection. My parents are strangers to me, and that's exactly how it needs to be. I don't hate them anymore. I don't think about them most days. They're just people who happened to give birth to me, but never learned to love me. That's their loss, not mine. And I'm finally, completely free. So, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like you had to earn love? Have you ever been in a relationship where you gave and gave and gave, but it never felt like enough? Have you ever had to choose between your own well-being and someone else's expectations? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes we need to know we're not alone in our struggles. Sometimes we need permission to choose ourselves. Consider this, that permission. Thank you for watching my story. Thank you for listening without judgment. Thank you for being here. I hope you find your own freedom, whatever that looks like for you. You deserve relationships that celebrate you, not exploit you. You deserve love that's freely given, not earned through sacrifice. You deserve peace. May you find it, protect it, and never apologize for choosing yourself. Take care of yourselves out there. You're worth it.